Is up, winning team. So today we're going to be talking about what happened in this 400-year period between the Old Testament and the New Testament, because it is not mentioned in the Bible. Therefore, we will turn to history, which we of course can, because the Bible is a historical text also, as well as being the lived, breathed word of the Lord. And a lot of very interesting stuff went down. If you guys don't know what's going on here, I basically am doing a summary of the whole entire Bible. And I wanted to include this separately, but still a part of it, because it tells you what was going on between the first two videos that I did from the Old Testament, and then we're going to do the New Testament. What actually happened? We finished off, if we remember, with the people of God now being under Persian rule. And even though they were living in their customs and whatever, but they were now overcome by Persia. They were no longer their own, running their own themselves. And now we find ourselves in whatever has gone on in these 400 years. So buckle up, guys. It's going to be a lot of history. And again, I'm going to be summarizing a lot of it, but you can go and look into all of it for yourself. It's very interesting to see what happens, and it's very interesting to see how things develop and change. And you guys will see what I mean as we get into it. Let's get straight into it. So at the end of the Old Testament, we're looking at about 586 BC. If you see me looking down, I'm just looking at my notes to make sure that I'm keeping my understanding of exactly what was going down. So, historically already, now at this point, the Jerusalem is a Persian province still, right? Now, what is going to happen is we have this scenario where we have Macedonia and Persia, who had been at odds with each other for a while, and in enters a very famous man by the name of Alexander the Great, who decides to take over both Palestine, Egypt, makes it to the Indian border, and then takes over the rulership of Judah, despite dying at age 33. Now, this was actually his father's idea. And obviously, Alexander the Great, obviously being Greek. Now, we're going to find two very important groups of people to begin with in this 400-year period. Two very important groups that are going to fight over Israel / Palestine. We're going to call it now, because we've now separated, and we're going to come to why Palestine became called the name of Palestine as well. And it's all to do with everything that happens in this 400-year period, right? Anyways, so in this time, we have two empires to take into account. So we've got the Seleucid Empire, which is the Greek Empire, and then we have the Ptolemaic Empire, which is the Egyptian Empire, right? So first things first, we had 586 BC, like I said, is where we started under the Persian Empire. Time goes on, we have Macedonia, we have Athens versus Persia. Alexander the Great takes over, even though he dies at the age of 33, and his land is split to a whole bunch of people, which, again, this splitting of the land thing that happens historically seems to backfire a lot from a lot of the historical things I've been looking into, but anyway. And so what ends up happening, that by the year 312 BC, the Seleucid Empire, the Greek Empire, has control of Antioch, Persia, territory in Syria, and eventually takes over this Israel / Palestine. Now, it's important to mention that the Greeks were also very much at odds with the Egyptians, and they also both had very different ideas of what they wanted, how they were going to govern the people of God, right? So as far as the Egyptians were concerned, they were less bothered with trying to get the people of God to do to follow their same gods, their same traditions, their languages and all of that. They were less bothered about that. They were just like, listen, as long as you're under our thumb, that's all that we care about. Like, you can go do what you want to do as long as we own you, basically. Well, not we own you, but we rule you, basically, right? Whereas the Greeks, or the Seleucid Empire, was more like, we are going to want you to adapt to our Greek customs if you're going to be a part of our empire. So by the time the year 305 BC, the Ptolemaic Empire, which is the now Egyptian Empire, manages to now gain control of Judah, right? I.e., what we're saying here, the people of God. And this is the longest and largest empire that the Egyptians ever had. And it was for 275 years. Eventually, the Ptolemaic Empire is eventually in another, nearly 300 years. We won't even talk about where they come in 300 years, because I don't want to be confusing here. So they fight for control at this point. The Ptolemaics and The Seleucids, remembering 586 BC, they were a Persian Empire. By the time it was 312 BC, they were Greek Empire, courtesy of Alexander the Great. We're now at 305 BC, and they become a part of the Ptolemaic Empire, which is the Egyptians. The Egyptians won in the end in terms of taking over control of them. Now, the Egyptians, like I said, were quite happy for them to go on with whatever they were doing. And by the way, all of this information that I'm telling you guys about, it all comes from what we call this, it all comes from, actually, we'll talk about that in a minute. We won't talk about where that comes from just yet. Oh, will we? Yeah, the Apocrypha, basically, all of these writings, essentially, of people that people had written. So they're not these are like the writings of what happened historically, but they're not part of the scriptures of the Bible, if that makes sense. Anyways, so by the time we reach the year 200th century BC, the Seleucid Empire has now taken over Judah, and now they are under the Greek rule. So before we even get into all of this is what I want to say. The failings of the people of God to stick with their God, and all of this division that they allowed, all of this worshipping other people's gods, all of this whatever, has led to a situation where essentially now they are just at the mercy of whoever else is more powerful doing what they need to do. This is exactly what I see in the world today. This is exactly my very frustration with the Christians of today. Obviously, these guys are not Christians, right? Because Christ hasn't come yet. So we're still talking about the Judeans. But I'm saying that those of us of today, like, guys, like, this is the same thing. We shouldn't be here under the thumb of rulership of some other people, but we're here because we've allowed it, because we have division, because we have a lack of unity, because of everything. Nothing has changed. Right now we're talking about 200 BC, right? 200 year BC. And look at us thousands of years later and nothing has changed. And it is very shameful, and we should all be ashamed of ourselves. Anyway, so the Greeks decide they want to push Judah more to gain their custom. So this is why now the Septuagint, which was the earliest Old Testament, is translated into Greek. They start to speak the Greek language because this is what the Greek people wanted, right? They wanted to push Judah more and more to practice their Greek beliefs. Again, like I'm saying, the Greeks were serious about who they believed. They were serious about their gods. And that's why, if they're serious about their gods, then they're gaining, it's like, this is what it's like. The best way I can describe it and why I'm talking about it like this, because it's the same thing we see in the world today. We have the Most High God. They don't have the Most High God, but they also have gods, right? If we are not walking in the power of our God, but they are walking in the power of their God, even though their God isn't as powerful as our God, they're going to win because they're walking in a spiritual power that we're not walking in. And that's exactly what was happening here. So they were trying to get the people of God to worship, to follow their customs, to going as far as to sacrifice the king, even sacrificing a pig in the temples of the gods of Judah. So in this time where they are being very heavily forced to change their customs, they're being told that laws are being passed that people are no longer allowed to be circumcised in the kingdom. They're being forced now to sacrifice to guess who? None other than Zeus. So the Greeks are now trying to enforce onto them, we need you to worship our gods. Did we remember the stories of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and all of these people before and not bowing to other gods? No, yes, we did. And actually, it led to a civil war in Judea, which was called the Maccabean Revolt, after Judas Maccabee. Now, Maccabee isn't actually Judas's actual name, but Maccabee was a title given because Maccabee means the hammer. These guys were upset, and they quickly were forced to take back over Judah, and they were actually successful, and they were able to purify the temple. And that's where the Jewish festival Hanukkah actually comes from, right? So eventually Judah gets its autonomy back, which is amazing. And what's their actual name? Yeah, the Hasmoneans. The Hasmoneans now take over and they form what's called the Hasmonean dynasty. And Judah is able to rule itself for all of 80 years. Now, that is as long as it lasted. They had a very lovely little moment here of fighting back and taking back the power and whatever, and they were pretty stable all until around 70/80 BC, when we have to now discuss the Romans. We are now less than 100 years for when Jesus Christ himself is about to pull up and we're about to be back into the Bible. It's very quick, isn't it? But there's other bits that I need to get into, which we're going to get into. So there is a division. They start fighting about who will rule, right? And the Romans will step in and take over one of the... Okay, hold on a second. Okay, sorry, you guys. So basically, because there's division in Israel, once again, Judeans are having division. They're having arguments. So just like what we see today when there's conflicts happening, somebody else decides to get involved. Rome's like, oh, you guys are having problems? You guys are having problems? We're going to come and help you. So they step in and eventually they take over one of the factions and make it a Roman state, right? And in 30 BC, they make Herod installed as a king of Israel by Rome. Now, this is a huge thing because Herod, of course, is not of the lineage of the people of God. And the way that Herod even got into this position in the first place is kind of insane, but we're not going to get into that just yet. We'll talk about that more as we develop into the other ideas. But obviously, Herod does a lot of good for the people of God. He helps them to rebuild the temple, right? He helps them to rebuild the temple. Well, he doesn't essentially rebuild it, but like refurbishes it for them. And they actually can live pretty well under him because he's a great builder. So the people of God were actually kind of somewhat grateful for him to be there. But again, now we're starting to see another different empire that's trying to take over the people of God, which is pretty insane. And this Herod, as we know, is very paranoid, very, very, very paranoid. Great at what he does, but severely paranoid. He dies around 4 BC eventually. And the main part of Judah ends up being ruled by somebody else who the Romans deemed to be too harsh. Now, I find this interesting. Am I going to say this in this video? Yeah, I'm going to say it. I find this interesting because in the transatlantic slave trade, right, there is one of the things that happened is when so in the transatlantic slave trade, right, Africans were selling other Africans to the varying European and or people that were coming around, and that's where the trade was working. They would supply the slaves, other people would supply resources, places like the England, United Kingdom and things, well, England, whatever, would supply capital like money, and it was all a very interesting system. What I found fascinating is that at a certain point, and this is what I'm saying is why history is really interesting, right? Because right now we're talking about like around 30 BC. We're around just before Christ. So this is like 2,000 years ago. And obviously the transatlantic slave trade was 400 years ago started, right? Well, about 600 years ago really now. But anyway, and it's just funny how the same thing happens, right? So the Romans step in here because they think that the person who's ruling in Judah is too harsh. So they install a governor. They install a governor that's going to govern the people of God. And this is where the New Testament is actually going to start. I find that really interesting in terms of the transatlantic slave trade, because again, when they were trading slaves, at a certain point, the European forces thought that the African people were being too harsh on their own people, and thus started to make their own changes because they're like, we think you're being too harsh on the slaves. We don't think you should be doing this. We need to come in and step in and help to, civilize you. This is why I find all of this really fascinating from where I'm sitting, both as a believer of God, also as a woman, as a black woman who has lived in Africa, as a black woman who's lived in America, black woman who's lived in the UK. It's all very interesting how it's all the same, right? Some people coming in because they're deeming that this was too harsh. And so just like the Romans, just thought that was an interesting thing to mention. So the Romans now have taken their freedoms, they're taxing them, choosing rulers, and Judah's expectation is that the Messiah will kick the Romans out. So that's what's setting the tone for exactly where we find ourselves in the New Testament. They're waiting for who's going to come and get rid of this Roman Empire who is really kind of coming in and trying to just tell us what to do and do all of this stuff, right? Because now they're in a big mess that they created because of their division. Had they not been divided, had they been united, maybe they could have defeated the Romans and they wouldn't be finding themselves in this position. Isn't it ironic that today we look at Christianity as Roman Catholic? We're going to talk about that as well. Guys, there's so much to talk about. There's so much to talk about. I've got so much to say about the entertainment industry. I've got so much to say about the Pope, about all of this. Now, one thing that we haven't yet discussed is what actually was going on individually with the people of Israel in this time. We've just looked at the time period that existed. Now I'm going to talk to you guys. I'm actually going to make a separate video for what the next part of what I'm going to do, right? Is we're now going to look at what the people of God were doing, because they actually split into 6 different groups. So Israel had split into 6 different groups. We have the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Herodians, the Sicarii, the Zealots, and the Essenes. These are 6 different groups. So now we've gone from we're not just split into 2 different north and south of Israel, which are now readily, as time is going on, going through very different things and becoming very different types of peoples, even though they were originally the same peoples. I don't know if you guys are hearing what I'm saying, right? Now we're going to split even further and have even more issues. So we're going to talk about exactly what that is, because the first Pharisees started to form around 200 BC. And for reference, that at that time is when they would have been under the rule of the Greeks, so the Seleucids, as I mentioned. So I've just given you guys a bit of a whistle-stop tour. By the time we start the Old Testament, we have now found out, we get to the New Testament, we are now under Roman rule. We started off under the Persians, then went over to, where was it? Let me make sure I'm not. Yeah, we started with the Persians, then taken over by the Greeks, courtesy of Alexander the Great, continuing with the Greeks into the year 312 BC, until taken over by the Ptolemaics, which are the Egyptians, in the year 305 BC. Fast forward to the year 200 BC, and we're back with the Greeks again, taking on the Greek customs. Fast forward, we have a little bit of time, a little 80-year period where we take over because we're sick of the Greeks, disrespecting our God as we should have been, slaughtering pigs in our temples. And we have an 80-year period where the people of God are ruling for themselves until they have division all over again. And then the Romans decide to step in to try and help and take over one of the states, eventually installing in Herod. When Herod died, they're not happy about what Herod was doing. They're not happy about who the predecessor was doing. So they decide to put in a governor. And lo and behold, now we have the New Testament. Now we have a New Testament, and we're going to talk about who these governors and who these people are and everything. But before that, we're going to talk about the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and all these people, and exactly what the differences were. Because you're going to see that, again, it's just the things that they were arguing about. It reminds me, this is like what we're about to see now is like the origins of the denominations of like the people of God. Because the disagreements they have and why they have all these different groups is because they all believe slightly different things. Anyways, we're going to talk about that in just a moment in the next video. So stay tuned for the video about the groups that the people of God split into during this 400-year period. That was me summarizing that whole 400 years. I hope that was helpful. I hope that was helpful. I hope I explained it clearly enough. I'm sorry, it's very historical. There's a lot of information that I'm trying to summarize into a very small amount of things, but don't take my word for it. You can go and do the research for yourself. Like I said, all the stuff that I'm trying to summarize for you right now is just to help you guys to have a way to like know a bunch of stuff without having to like spend as much time as I've said, because I've spent like hours and 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 days doing this. But yeah, so go and check all of that out. And in the next video, I'm going to explain to you all exactly who these 6 groups were and what exactly that they were doing. On that note, if life's a game, let's play to win. After that, we'll then go into the New Testament, and then, yeah, it's good. I'm enjoying this quite a lot. I think this is so interesting. I think this is fascinating because it's fascinating to see how nothing actually changes. Anyway, if life's a game, let's play to win. I'll see you guys in the next video. God bless you. God loves you. I love you. I'll see you in my next one.